We're one of these, aren't we? Keep your heads warm.
Yeah.
So,
I know this. I know it's quite a hard cold. Okay, right, we're starting.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the November meeting of the Lower Thames Crossing Task Force. The meeting of the Lower Thames Task Force, originally scheduled for the 18th of October 2021, will commence immediately after the conclusion of the business of the November meeting. Following the conclusion of the business of the October meeting, December 2021 year. I'll start with apologies for absence.
Yeah, we've received apologies from Councillor Stavins, Councillor Carter, Councillor Kent, Peter Ward, business representative, and Laura Blake, Thames Crossing Action representative.
Thank you, Lucy. Let's on to number 2, the minutes. I move the minutes of the Lower Thames Crossing Task Force meeting held on the 20th of September 2021 be approved as a correct record. Are there any comments on the action of the minutes? Number 3, urgent items of business. I have not agreed to any items of urgent business this evening. Declarations of interest, agenda item 4. Does anyone wish to declare a declaration of interest? You know, around the room. Thank you. So, moving on to agenda item 5. This is the Transport Action Network presentation, which Chris Todd is going to present via Microsoft Teams. Chris, we've allowed 45 minutes including questions. I don't know how much time we need, hopefully keep with those guidelines, and over to you, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me tonight. I hope you can all hear me okay, and because it's...
You're a bit quiet, Chris, sorry, I'm going to try and find you out. Okay, Chris, can you just try speaking again, see if that would work?
Yeah, it's Chris Todd from Transport Action Network. Is that better? I'll try and speak loudly, or maybe shout a bit at the microphone, and hopefully you can hear.
I'm at the speaker, it's just a bit quietly.
Okay. As I said, thanks for inviting me. I certainly don't intend to talk for 45 minutes. I don't intend probably to talk more than about 10 minutes, and then open it up for questions, if that's what is required. I'm just explaining about Transport Action Network. We're a national organisation that exists to support local communities who are wanting to promote sustainable transport or are facing bus cuts or damaging road schemes in their area. And we've been around for about 2 years. I previously did this role for Campaign for Better Transport, which is a national NGO, but they stopped providing local support. In March 2020, in the budget, the government said it was committed itself to the largest ever roads programme, Roads Investment Strategy 2, or RIS2 for short. We have challenged that under under climate grounds, and the fact that the government, we don't believe, fully took into consideration the impact on the climate and the carbon emissions arising from the roads programme. That was heard in the High Court in June. Unfortunately, that went against us, but we have applied to the Court of Appeal for permission to appeal, and we're waiting to hear back on that. So potentially the case is still live. It hasn't finished at this moment, and we hope to hear in the next week or two whether we will be given permission. Regardless of what we've been challenging and doing, I think it's quite clear with COP26 in Glasgow, there's a much greater awareness of the impact of climate change. There's a much greater awareness of the impact that road building is having on carbon emissions and our ability to meet our national targets. Indeed, Lord Deben, who's John Gummer, the chair of the Climate Change Committee, has questioned, the roads programme himself, which is some of the strongest words that we've heard in recent years from the Climate Change Committee. This year, though, has been quite notable, not just in terms of COP26, but last year the government, in preparation for COP26, committed to its nationally determined contribution, which was the target it set itself as part of the deal coming out of the Paris Agreement. And it agreed, or said it would commit to a 68% cut in emissions by 2030 on 1990 levels. Now that's important because that target comes ahead of the sixth carbon budget, which was set in June. Now the sixth carbon budget is the amount of emissions that the UK has set itself can be emitted between 2033 and 2037 inclusive. That's a 5-year carbon budget. The one before that is the fifth carbon budget, and that's the one that covers the NDC target, the 68% target. But that fifth carbon budget is much looser. It allows for quite a lot of emissions, which actually probably wouldn't get us on target. So the target that the government has set, the NDC, is much stricter. And that's important when you're coming to consider the application that National Highways will submit, because they will compare everything against the carbon budgets. And they'll say the carbon budget, the fourth carbon budget, the fifth carbon budget, the sixth carbon budget, and they will compare the emissions that are expected, that are rising from the road, and they will compare it against those budgets. But that doesn't take into account the fact that this target of 68% is much stricter. It's much tougher target to actually reach, but they won't account for that. So that's something to flag up as an potential issue with the application when it arises. The other aspect, which you're probably aware of, is the budget, which actually saw a cut for the roads investment strategy, second roads investment strategy, from 27 billion to 24 billion. A lot of that is due to the delay to the Lower Thames crossing. And indeed, it's not clear whether the Lower Thames crossing is mostly being pushed into the next roads investment strategy, which would be the third one, which would come into effect after 2025. As I said, it's not clear what National Highways are doing, but a lot of the drop in the funding for this roads programme is due to the delays to the Lower Thames crossing. Other things that have happened in the last month, we've had the Environment Act it was passed into law, which will be reviewing air quality limits. Now, in September, the World Health Organization drastically cut its guideline limits for PM2.5s, which are the very small particles. And its guideline limit now for the annual mean is 5 micrograms per cubic metre, whereas the UK's current legal limit, or current guideline limit, I think it is, for PM2.5s is 25 micrograms per cubic metre. So the World Health Organization guidelines are a fifth of what our guidelines are. And that is something that certainly we, and I know a lot of other people, will be pushing, that those should become the new targets. The WHO guidelines should become the new targets. The other one, which is particularly relevant to the Lower Thames crossing, is the nitrogen dioxide levels guidelines. Those have been slashed to 10 micrograms per cubic metre for an annual mean. The current legal limit, which comes from the EU, which was passed into UK law, is 40 micrograms per cubic metre. So that's effectively the limits are being slashed by a quarter if those were adopted. And the WHO 24-hour guideline is only 25 micrograms per cubic metre compared to 200 being the current UK guideline and UK limit. So the World Health Organization has updated its guidelines based on, the latest evidence and the fact that for many of these pollutants there are no known safe levels, and that's why it has cut the PM2.5, the nitrogen dioxide levels, so dramatically. Other pollutants it hasn't changed as much. And that is particularly important. I think is certainly pertinent, and even regardless of whether there are legal limits, the evidence is building that we need to revisit what we consider as dangerous air pollution. And obviously, I think it adds weight to communities that will be affected by this road and the air pollution that will arise from it, that actually just basing it on the fact that it might meet UK's current legal limits doesn't mean that it's safe and healthy. And that is something potentially that could be an issue for this road. Finally, I think the other big thing that has changed in the last few months is that the business department updated the carbon values for carbon emissions in September, and that was adopted by the Department for Transport and is now in the what's known as the TAG data book. So it's official guidance that National Highways should be following, and other promoters as well, in terms of assessing the economic value or impact of those carbon emissions. Those carbon costs have increased significantly by about, between 5 and over 10 times, depending on they increase as the years go on. So there isn't a sort of a set factor that they've increased by, but the minimum increase is by over 5 times the current values that are being used for values in and around the dates of 2020 and 2025. As you get towards 2050 or 2080, then the values have increased massively. That means, I just did a very quick calculation that the carbon costs for the construction costs for the construction emissions of 2 million tonnes would be over £500 million, or over £500 million. Thus, for the construction costs alone, the 2 million tonnes of carbon dioxide are what National Highways have previously estimated would be the construction emissions for the Lower Thames crossing. Now that is quite a substantial number, and then you've got user emissions to be factored in on top of that, which would add, quite a lot more as well. So I think there's quite a changed landscape in both sort of requirements that National Highways will need to sort of conform to, and new guidelines which they certainly should be taking account of. And I think, given the sort of emphasis that COP26 has given, and I think showing that we haven't sorted the emissions reductions sufficiently globally, and that also applies within the UK, that we need to be looking at making as many cuts as we can, as often as we can, where we can. And so building a massive big road with huge emissions doesn't seem to be the right way to be going. So that's really sort of a bit of background of some of the sort of technicalities that have changed in and around the Lower Thames crossing. I mean, you're probably more aware of the issues around the conflict with the Freeport and the boundary issues there, which I don't know if they've been resolved as yet, but that's obviously caused further delay, and potentially will cause further delay as they try and work out how the two can coexist and be taken forward together. I mean, I think that's probably mostly what I've got to say. I mean, we are obviously in contact with the Thames Crossing Action Group. We've been sort of monitoring this road scheme because it is the biggest road scheme in the roads programme. It's the biggest road for a generation in terms of costs and emissions. So it is very significant. But I don't think I've got much more to say at this stage, but I'm happy to answer or field any questions if you'd like.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very informative. Open it up.
And thank you, Chris, for coming on. Can you hear okay?
Not very.
No, no.
I move further down.
Yeah, that might be helpful. Can you hear me better now? Or
Yeah.
yeah.
Because I know children's services, the people who were nearer to the laptop could hear them, but as a chair, you couldn't hear me. Yeah, sorry, Chris. First of all, I just wanted to make sure that thanks for coming along. That was very informative. Some things that I had been aware of, but others that I didn't. And I just wanted to clarify your point about the goal, the NDC, the greater commitment to 67% cut in the emissions by 2030. And you talked about different carbon budgets. Can you just sort of go over that again? I'm not quite sure I got how that relates to the OTC.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I should probably produce a graph, or maybe I can send a graph showing outlining the different carbon budgets, which might help. Basically, the committee for the Climate Change Committee, as it's now called, provisionally sets a carbon budget every 5 years. It recommends to government to set this carbon budget, and that is what is needed to get the UK on the right track to achieving net zero by 2050. Because it's not just about having this target in 2050, because we could leave it till 2049, you know, to try and do everything, and by that time we'd actually have used up more carbon than we're allowed to, or you know, which would be our fair share, if you like. So every 5 years it sets a carbon budget, which is basically declining in amount as we progress through the calendar. So we're in, I think it's the third carbon budget at the moment. You can work it out from 2032 to 2028 is the fifth. So 2027 to 2022 is the fourth. So we're at the end of the third carbon budget at the moment. But I can send a graph of that through to help. And that is what the UK legally has to meet under the Climate Change Act. So once that is set by the government, it's accepted by the government and voted on in Parliament, that is what it has to meet. The point I was making is that national highways will just relate to those carbon budgets, because that, you know, those are the legal limits that the UK has set, and it will compare the emissions of the Lower Thames Crossing to the UK national budget. Now, there's a whole argument as to whether that is an appropriate thing to do, because a scheme would have had to be so huge as to, you know, have a significance compared to the total national UK budget. You wouldn't do that in most other circumstances if you're measuring air pollution, or if you're measuring you know, the number of, say, listed buildings in an area that might be impacted by development compared to the total number in the UK, and then go, well, it's only 0.001%, therefore it's insignificant. You don't do that. If it affects a listed building, it's a significant impact. But for carbon, we have this ridiculous test where it's compared to the UK total, and therefore for a single project it will be very small percentage. But that's what National Highways would do. The point I was making is that the nationally determined contribution, this 68% target in 2030, is a much stricter, tighter target than is shown by that is included by the fifth carbon budget, because it falls halfway through the fifth carbon budget, and yet the fifth carbon budget wouldn't show that percentage drop in percent. I will try and maybe do a graph to explain this a bit better than me just trying to talk it through, if that helps.
Yeah, no, I think I've got it. I think I've got the distinction now. I understand. So, because of the NDC for 2030 is a much stricter target than that's shown by the overall carbon budget. So that means if the LTC is considered as part of that target, it would be a more significant factor. Well, it should be a significant factor anyway.
Yeah, it would have a more significant impact on the government's ability to meet that target. I mean, in itself, it was. I mean, it's a massive amount of carbon from this project, but in itself, compared to the UK budget, it will seem very small.
Yeah.
But that's not a reason for doing it. It's a bit like saying, well, the benefit of installing an electric charger for an EV, or is very, very small. It's minuscule. But it doesn't mean you don't do it, because that actually has very great benefit, and especially when you multiply it up across the country or across the district or whatever. And it's the same with the road building argument, and why we challenged the RIS2 is that you add all of these roads together and they start to become very significant. And it's the direction of travel that is important. And the road building programme is taking you in the wrong direction of travel compared to where we need to be.
Yeah, it's always seemed to me that our climate change ambitions that we're articulating as a country, and the government's articulating, are completely at odds with the road building programme.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to come back to was air pollution and PM 2.5. In particular, well, also all the ones that you mentioned. So, as I understand it, there's going to be a consultation early next year, and then the government is going to commit to new targets, including PM 2.5, for all of these air pollution measures by the 31st of October 2022. Obviously, that will mean that comes, even if they put in their DCO tomorrow, that those targets will be set before the Lower Thames crossing work can begin on the Lower Thames crossing, even if they put in their DCO tomorrow and it got accepted and they were ready to go. So have we got an indication if we did move to the WHO guideline levels? I mean, we know that the Lower Thames crossing as it stands at the moment would fail for PM 2.5, the whole route would fail. So is there a legal address there, or is that something that can be pursued during the DCO process for us to oppose the LTC on pollution levels? Because I can't see how that kind of effect can be mitigated satisfactorily by any kind of DCO process.
Yeah, it depends on there's several things. It depends on the legal limits that the government will sign up to, and certainly during the setting of the the discussions around the environment bill before it became an act, it was resisting specifying the WHO limits at that point. So there's going to be a sort of a need for to convince the government what are the appropriate levels to be it should be adopting as the legal limits. So there's going to be a challenge there to get it to adopt more stringent limits. If those more stringent limits are then sort of showing that, for example, the Lower Thames crossing would fail, then that does give you, you know, a strong case against it. It doesn't necessarily mean it completely stop it, but it certainly would be a very strong argument against the scheme going ahead. The other aspect is that the WHO guidelines don't disappear, so there's still, you know, a sort of an evidence base on health grounds why it's still bad, even if say the new limits that the government accepts and say the Lower Thames crossing still, you know, can meet those limits. There's still an argument that the WHO guidelines are pertinent and should be considered, because they're saying that there are no safe levels for these pollutants. And as I said, PM2.5 and nitrogen dioxide were two that it significantly cut. It didn't do that for other pollutants. It's not that it's just slashed everything on a whim. It's actually looked at the evidence and the research to come to those. So I think that there is a strong argument on air pollution grounds. How strong it is will depend on the limits that are accepted in the Environment Act. And I would also throw caution about timeframes, because government's not very good at sticking to timeframes either.
I mean, you know, from our point of view, as members here will know that the Lower Thames crossing, if it goes ahead, comes within like 200 yards, and sort of half a kilometre of a lot of schools, you know, including one of our special schools, and indeed a new school that's in the process of being built. Or will be in the process of being built, where children are already temporarily housed there. So not only will they be in the middle of a building construction zone for however long it takes to build, but I mean, God knows what the impact of that kind of pollution, those kind of pollution levels are going to have on young lungs that are still developing and our children's health. So it's something that I'm really, really concerned about, and I'm disappointed that we still haven't had any movement on the health inequalities impact assessment. I think that's a real dereliction of duty on the part of National Highways. But I live in hope that we will eventually find out. But I hope it's not going to be at the point where it's too late to do anything about. But I mean, they need to come clean about the real health impacts of this road, and we need to fight it all the way for the sake of our children's health.
Just very quickly on the point you make about being close to schools, I think noise impact will also be significant, because that will be a determinant in terms of concentration, and for people who are living nearby, also in terms of sleep.
Yeah.
Sorry, Polly, did you want to come in there?
Thanks. It was just to say that all of the points that Chris has raised and articulated are elements that we are in active discussions with and are seeking to find clarification from National Highways on, particularly their claim that this carbon emission from this scheme is insignificant. We understand that the LTC is likely to increase traffic across the River Thames by about 50% at least. We don't necessarily share their definition of insignificant, and I think it's timely to have a more open and constructive dialogue around the future implications of this road infrastructure investment. So it is one that we'll seek to continue on a number of fronts, and the air pollution and noise pollution elements are absolutely ones that we are continuing to seek clarification on, and to understand when we will have access to their updated air pollution modelling data, which we still haven't had access to, and we are concerned about going out to consultation again without having any access to that data. Thank you.
Colin. Any other members have any questions for Christoph? Robert Quick, who is the public representative, has a question for you, Chris.
Chris, I just wanted to clarify, what is the difference between the emissions level once the road is built and running and that while it's being constructed? Do they both fail against the guidelines? Is there any difference in the way the DCO would be reviewed on two separate areas?
Well, there isn't a sort of a fail, if you like. It's just it's the significance of the emissions overall. The construction emissions are made up of the emissions that are released when you chop down vegetation, trees and bushes and scrub, and when you clear the land for construction. So there's a whole load of emissions there that get released. Then there's the emissions of moving lots of earth and spoil around. And I think that's one of the ways that they are looking to reduce their emissions by dumping it in the vicinity now, closer to the tunnel than they were originally going to move it further afield and take it away from the area. So that's one of my understandings, how they're trying to reduce the carbon footprint. It may have other negative impacts that you're not happy with, I don't know. So there's a lot of emissions there that are to do with moving around, and that comes from the big dumper trucks that will burn diesel, moving all of that spoil, and because there's so much of it, that's why it's quite significant. So that is most of the sort of, and then you've got the carbon that's associated with the steel and concrete. And in that manufacturing, because again, that will be quite significant in this sort of long tunnel. So that's why Lower Thames Crossing has quite a significant construction emissions compared to most other road schemes. Once the road is opened, then the most of the emissions that will arise are from the users, i.e. the people driving on it, and what National Highways should be doing is looking at what are the existing traffic levels, and what are the sort of emissions associated with those, and then what compared to what will be the emissions with the Lower Thames Crossing. Now they won't just look at the line of the Lower Thames Crossing, because obviously at the moment that is absolutely zero because there's no one driving across an imaginary route, but they will look at sort of relevant other roads in the neighbourhood. Obviously the Dartford Crossing is the one. So with the Lower Thames Crossing, it's likely there will be some fall in traffic at Dartford Crossing, but not necessarily that significant. But overall there will be a big increase in traffic, and it's that increase in traffic that they will assign to the project. So it's the increase, because the baseline level of traffic, which is the traffic that's already crossing the river, whether it's at Dartford or somewhere else, that's obviously, that's there now. So it'd be unfair to assign that to the Lower Thames Crossing. But the Lower Thames Crossing should have assigned to it anything that it generates over and above the existing levels. So that will be the big traffic increase that it will create. The emissions arising from that traffic increase is what's counted as the user emissions. Now there are again arguments as to how thorough that assessment is, but their estimates at the moment are 3.2 million tonnes of carbon. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Councillor Byrne has a question.
Yep, can you hear me? So listen, basically what it's saying, during the build, everything they touch will create carbon emissions. There's nothing that's not going to create. You might as well say everything as soon as they open in the morning, it's carbon emissions. nothing's going to be carbon emission free there during that build. They're going from trees to diesel to everything, so it seems like everything is going to create emissions.
Yeah, that's right, and that's what they've estimated the 2 million tonnes of carbon emissions for construction. I was just trying to give a breakdown as to how they.
Thank you.
Councillor Muldowney has another question.
Oh,
Should all start sitting around the wire.
Yeah.
Come down.
yeah, so Colin, would that be the 50% more traffic that you're talking about? So Chris is saying the extra traffic that will happen because of the LTC, is that's the 50% more traffic it will bring that you were talking about? So that makes up. Now,
Yeah, and you have to also, sorry.
Sorry.
I was going to say, you have to also remember that it's not just 50, very little of that additional traffic is coming from Thurrock. It's coming from the wider region. And so it's not just affecting our bit of the network. It will affect bits of the A13 in particular out to the east, and the A130 as traffic comes down that route to access LTC.
And I mean, I think we're talking about emissions, and most people think about car emissions, but they are quite heavily regulated now. I mean, the thing that I've been reading about is that more and more air pollution is being caused by non-exhaust emissions, which, as we change over to electric vehicles, that's from like tyres and brake pads, and it's quite high amounts of PM2.5, as I understand it, and PM10 are currently being caused by these non-exhaust emissions, which are not currently regulated.
And the other thing you have to remember is that the vehicle electrification will take best part of a couple of decades to run through the car vehicle fleet. And then you have to think about, well, what about all the HGVs and LGVs on the network as well, which make up a considerable portion of the traffic. So it's not the golden bullet that some people might think it will be.
And also, because electric cars are heavier because of the batteries, they're actually going to produce more of these non-exhaust emissions than more tyre wear than your normal petrol car. Maybe not your diesel HGV, but your normal petrol car or diesel car for that matter. So has that been factored in anywhere that you're aware of in terms of, or they just don't look at that at the moment? There's no regulation around it.
We keep asking National Highways to release their data, and we haven't yet been successful in getting access to understand what it is they are actually modelling. So until such time as they can provide some clarity on their modelling approach and allow us to see that, it's very difficult to comment. And we assume that if it had been done in the most up-to-date manner, that showed the potential scenarios, that they would have shared that with us by now. We don't quite understand why it's taking so long to share this information with us.
Yeah, I can't believe we're still waiting for that. Well, I can believe it, unfortunately. Thank you.
Councillor Chuckle has a question.
Hello, Chris. With the 68% cut of the emission by 2030, my question is, what are the additional measures to meet that target? Put in place to meet the target.
So, sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Because there's a target for 68% cut of emission by 2030.
Yeah.
I'm asking, what are the additional measures put in place to reach that target, to meet the target?
Okay. Well, in terms of what other people are saying is that we actually need some form of traffic reduction, and if you have traffic reduction, that starts to undermine the case for new roads, because I think the point that Colin was making is that you can't electrify the fleet quickly enough. In 2030, even if you have a ban on petrol and diesel vehicles, the majority of the car fleet will still be petrol and diesel, most likely. I mean, these are all guesstimates because people are projecting what's going to be happening, but these are coming from government and the Climate Change Committee, is that most likely we will still have a majority of petrol and diesel vehicles on the road at that point. And the thing about HGVs and LGVs is that they are further behind the curve in terms of electrification because of the issues around the amount of power and energy they need to move stuff around, because they're so much bigger. And if you take up a lot of their payload with batteries, you've got less payload they can actually carry. So you know, there's various reports that have been done which are saying that we do need significant traffic reduction, and that's what the devolved administrations in Wales and Scotland are saying. Both of them have traffic reduction targets based around either personal car use or car miles. So it's not necessarily encompassing HGVs and LGVs, but nevertheless, it would result in a tempering of the amount of emissions that would be released, because we need to go faster than we think we can get to with just electrification alone. So, I mean, these aren't things necessarily within the gift of national highways, although the scale of what it's proposing could influence some of that, or it could be involved with demand management measures. But this is really a bigger issue, if you like, that if we are going to meet some of these targets, we're going to need to do more than just electrify the vehicle fleet. And building new roads generates more traffic. So again, it's taking us in the wrong direction.
Any further questions? Any questions, Tom? I think that's all the questions from the task force, Chris. I just want to say thank you very much again for your time attending today.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very useful.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Okay, members, moving on to agenda item 6, the work programme. Does any member have any further items they would like to add? I have one. Chris and Colin. Could we have a report in regards to the freefall and the change in impacts on the LTC?
Do you want a report or a quick update now?
If we go a quick update in January, would that be possible?
Yeah, let's see why not. All right.
Thank you. Any other members for the work programme? No, I think that's it. And this concludes the business of the meeting this evening. I now declare the meeting closed at 18:48 PM. Thank you.
Just stay on that line, guys. I'm just going to stop this meeting and start the next one. So,
Are you still recording?